Will you give Mr. Abrego Garcia the due process that the Supreme Court and Judge Wilkinson has required you to give him?
Abrego Garcia is an El Salvador resident who is in his home country. If he were to come back to this country, he would be immediately removed again.
How do you know?
He has received and been treated appropriately.
So
and he is not.
How can you say he's been treated appropriately if the Supreme Court has ruled 9-0, 9-0 that he hasn't been treated appropriately? Why is your opinion better and have more authority than the Supreme Court?
When the Supreme Court rules unanimously, 9-0, you would think that ends the debate. But in this hearing, Congressman Dan Goldman confronted DHS Secretary Kristi Noem for ignoring that exact reality. What started as a simple civics question quickly turned into a showdown over constitutional authority, due process, and whether the executive branch believes it's above the judiciary. This wasn't just fiery, it was a warning shot about what happens when government power collides with the rule of law.
I now recognize Mr. Goldman for 5 minutes questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to go back to Mr. Kilmar Abrego Garcia's case, Madam Secretary. But my first question for you is a pretty simple one. It's basic civics. Which branch of government does the Constitution give the authority to interpret what the law is, the judiciary or the executive branch?
Sir, going forward, the interpretation of the law, you make the laws in this body. The judicial branch makes sure that they have integrity and they're applied properly to individuals.
So I'm just going to take that as the judiciary branch. Now, let's focus for a second on what the judiciary branch has said about this case. We know the Supreme Court has said 9-0 that notwithstanding your statements under oath here today, that Mr. Kilmar Abrego Garcia was afforded due process, he was in fact not afforded due process, because then if he were, you would have seen the withholding order that did not permit him to be deported to El Salvador. Now you allege, and I guess the Attorney General alleges, that he's a member of MS-13. That may very well be the case. And if he is, now that that is a foreign terrorist organization, certainly the immigration laws would allow him, and in fact require him, to be deported. I certainly would support that. But the problem that we have here is what you allege, what Ms. Green alleges, what the Attorney General alleges, is not the judiciary. You don't get to decide whether or not he is an MS-13 member. And you don't have to take my word for it, because Judge Wilkinson, a Fourth Circuit judge, very conservative, addressed this argument. He said, the government asserts that Abrego Garcia is a terrorist and a member of MS-13. Perhaps, but perhaps not. Regardless, he is still entitled to due process. If the government is confident in its position, it should be assured that position will prevail in proceedings to terminate the withholding of removal order. Will you commit right now to give Mr. Abrego Garcia that process where you can prove your allegation that he is a member of MS-13?
Congressman, that judge that you just quoted did not say he was not a member of MS-13. Who did say that he was a member of MS-13 was law enforcement officers that encountered this individual.
Yeah, he knows that. This is a Fourth Circuit judge. He knows all of what the evidence is, and he's saying if that evidence... So you're not going to commit to follow this order? You won't commit to follow this court order?
By the way, he identified
Madam Secretary,
himself.
I reclaim my time. Stop filibustering. Stop filibustering.
By gang members of MS-13.
Will you give Mr. Abrego Garcia the due process that the Supreme Court and Judge Wilkinson has required you to give him?
Abrego Garcia is an El Salvador resident who is in his home country. If he were to come back to this country, he would be immediately removed again.
How do you know?
He has received and been treated appropriately,
and
he is not.
How can you say he's been treated appropriately if the Supreme Court has ruled 9-0? 9-0 that he hasn't been treated appropriately. Why is your opinion better and have more authority than the Supreme Court?
Investigators, 2 judges, an immigration court that all said he was MS-13 and was removed from this country.
But you understand, that is you saying that. That is you saying that.
That is them saying that. This
No,
is
no, no, no.
investigators and law
That is
enforcement
you
officers
making that
in the case they
determination.
built against him. If you don't
The
trust our law
court
enforcement
has
officers
considered all that.
and
The judge has
investigators,
considered all that, Madam
who do you
Secretary.
trust if you
And
don't
if you would be
trust judges?
quiet, because I'm reclaiming my time, you are not following this court order. But let's focus on the court order, because this opinion also says that to facilitate, which the Supreme Court is requiring, is an active verb. It requires that steps be taken. What steps have you taken to return Mr. Abrego Garcia to allow him to get due process?
Abrego Garcia is in his home country.
What
If he were to come
steps
back,
have
your
you
advocacy-
taken?
If your continued advocacy for him were to...
I'm not advocating for him.
Yes, you
I'm
are.
advocating for a
Absolutely.
court order, Madam
Gone to the
Secretary.
mat for this
The
man
court
who
order
has terrorized
says
people
that
in
you
traffic
must take
with human
steps
beings.
to follow the court order. You are here under oath. What steps have you taken to return Mr. Abrego Garcia pursuant to this court order?
It's got to be extremely discouraging to be one of your constituents. To see you fight for a terrorist like this and not fight for them is extremely alarming to me.
I'm fighting for due process, and that's under the Constitution.
Gentleman's
and you
time
should
has
fight too for due
expired.
process.
The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize.
Congressman Dan Goldman didn't come in swinging with accusations. He started with the basics. Which branch of government interprets the law, he asked Secretary Noem. That's textbook civics. The answer is obvious, the judiciary. And Noem gave a careful acknowledgement of that, but with hesitation, with hedging. Already you could see where this was headed. Goldman then steered directly into the case of Mr. Abrego Garcia. Now, this isn't some abstract policy debate. It's a real case where the Supreme Court, in a rare unanimous 9-0 decision, said Garcia had not been afforded due process. That's the highest court in the land, speaking with one voice. And Goldman reminded Noem, despite her statements under oath claiming Garcia had been treated fairly, the court had ruled otherwise. This is where the tension snapped. Goldman acknowledged the obvious. If Garcia really is MS-13, then the law requires his removal. Nobody was defending MS-13. Goldman wasn't carrying water for gang members. He was fighting for the principle that accusations aren't enough. In America, even the worst among us are still entitled to due process. That's the foundation of our system. But Noem, she dug in. She leaned on law enforcement reports and the Attorney General's claims, treating those accusations as settled fact. She pushed back that officers had determined Garcia was MS-13. Goldman's response was sharp. That's not how the Constitution works. Law enforcement doesn't get to be judge and jury. That's what courts are for. And he didn't stop there. Goldman quoted Judge Wilkinson, a deeply conservative Fourth Circuit judge, who underscored the point. Maybe Garcia is MS-13, maybe he's not, but regardless, he's still entitled to due process. If the government's evidence is solid, then it should withstand scrutiny in court. End of story. But Kristi Noem wouldn't commit. Goldman pressed her again and again. Would she follow the Supreme Court order? Would she commit to giving Garcia the due process that both the Supreme Court and Judge Wilkinson demanded? Noem dodged. She repeated that Garcia was back in El Salvador, that he'd been treated appropriately, that he'd be removed if he returned. Goldman wasn't having it. He pointed out the obvious contradiction. How can you claim Garcia was treated appropriately when the Supreme Court unanimously ruled he wasn't? What gives a cabinet secretary more authority than the Supreme Court of the United States? That's not just a clash of opinions. That's a direct challenge to the separation of powers. And here's where it got ugly. Instead of answering, Noem accused Goldman of fighting for a terrorist. That's a heavy smear, designed to shut down debate by painting anyone who demands accountability as defending the enemy. But Goldman cut through it, saying clearly, I'm not fighting for him, I'm fighting for the Constitution. That line right there crystallized the entire exchange. Think about the implications. If the executive branch can ignore the judiciary, if officials can shrug off a Supreme Court ruling as if it's optional, then due process isn't real. It's conditional. It only applies when the government feels like it. And once that precedent is set, it doesn't stop with MS-13. It can be used against anyone. This is where Goldman's questioning took on a much bigger weight. It wasn't just about Garcia. It was about whether we still live under a government of laws or a government of personalities, whether due process is a shield for every citizen or just a privilege handed out selectively. Noem's refusal to commit wasn't just evasive, it was dangerous. It suggested an executive branch willing to sidestep the judiciary when it's inconvenient. That's not just a bureaucratic squabble, that's a constitutional crisis in slow motion.
This hearing wasn't about one man. It was about whether our leaders still respect the system of checks and balances that defines our republic. Dan Goldman's questions exposed something chilling, a cabinet secretary openly resistant to a unanimous Supreme Court ruling. When due process becomes negotiable, democracy itself is at risk. Because if the government can deny it to someone it accuses of being a gang member today, it can deny it to you tomorrow. The Constitution doesn't protect the popular. It doesn't protect the powerful. It protects everyone. And in that room, Goldman wasn't defending Garcia. He was defending that principle. He was defending the idea that no official, not even a DHS secretary, stands above the court or above the Constitution. So here's the real takeaway. This hearing revealed a fault line in our democracy. And the question for all of us is simple. Do we demand leaders who obey the rule of law, or do we accept a system where power decides who gets rights and who doesn't? What do you think? Was Goldman right to hammer Secretary Noem for defining the Supreme Court, or was she justified in prioritizing what she sees as security over process? Drop your thoughts below, and if you want more sharp breakdowns like this, subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss what happens next.